Hello YouTube! Today, in honor of Valentine's Day, which was 2 days ago, we are going to talk about love. A topic that I don't often discuss on this channel, which is supposed to be about fitness, but one that is extremely important because the goal of life and the ultimate purpose of it all is love. And we're going to talk about it in the context of my favorite love story of all time, namely the story of Berserk. And that might sound a bit surprising because, to some, Berserk is a dark fantasy with demons, battles, and giant swords. And you wouldn't be wrong to believe that. But if you actually look at the plot of Berserk, you'll realize that it articulates itself entirely around a romance. A romance between two characters, namely Guts and Casca. And so despite the supernatural setting that is not very realistic at all, you'll find that one of the most compelling aspects of Berserk, and the one that seems to touch people the most, is that romance. Because the author, Kentaro Miura, perfectly understood that the core of what makes a good story is love. And so, if you want your story to touch people, you have to tell a love story. And since every single love story is first and foremost a tragedy, that explains why the story of Berserk is so tragic. And today, I want to dive deep into the philosophy of tragedy and love itself. Because if we are to accept that every love story is a tragedy, this also means that this is going to be something you're going to experience one day. And so I think that you need to be prepared for that. So even if you've never read Berserk, you will still greatly benefit from the philosophy in this essay. That being said, I also encourage you to discover Berserk by yourself. So in today's video, in terms of spoilers, I'm going to limit myself to the Golden Age arc, meaning that if you've read that part of the story, you are covered. If you haven't, and this is new to you, yeah, it's going to be a bit obscure and you might be a bit lost throughout this video. So if you so decide, don't feel bad about pausing it, going to read Berserk, the Golden Age arc, and then coming back to the video. You deserve to discover this love story by yourself. Now that this is established, I need first and foremost to explain why I say that Berserk is a love story, because that is not evident. Even though it contains a love story, that's obvious, every single piece of media where there is a love interest doesn't magically become a love story. It doesn't work like this. A love story to me is a plotline that literally depends on that romance to exist. Without the romance, it is completely irrelevant. So, if we are to look at Berserk through that lens, we have to look underneath the surface, because the story of Berserk summarized would be something like a guy who loses his friends and then goes on a crusade to fight the demons that killed his friends in order to avenge them, with the ultimate goal being to defeat the chief or leader of the demons, in this case, Griffith. And in that little summary, there's not much love at all. If anything, it sounds like the complete opposite. It doesn't sound like a love story. It sounds like a hate story. It sounds like a revenge story that is fueled purely by hatred. But that's if you only look at it from the surface, as I said. Because if we actually dive deeper, we see that what motivates all of that hate is originally love. In the same vein, if we take the story of Romeo and Juliet, we'll see that the plot in itself is really the feud between two families. And that feud results in violence and it results in casualties. There's not much love in that. But the reason why the feud escalates to that level of violence is because there is a forbidden love story between the two heroes of Romeo and Juliet that ends up triggering the fights that lead to the death of so many characters. If you have read it, you know that there are 6 people who die in Romeo and Juliet. That sounds quite dire for something that is supposedly at face value only a love story. So we see here that the boundary between love and death, love and hatred, love and tragedy seem to be extremely porous. If anything, they don't seem to exist at all. It seems to me that the majority of the time when a story tells us about love or romance, it has to be a tragedy. It's sort of part for the course. And I think that the same can be seen in Berserk, because even though, yes, the story spends a lot of time showing us battles and death, it spends just as much time showing the development of the romance and love between the two characters, Guts and Casca. Think back to the Golden Age arc, How many times do we have these two by themselves talking to each other with no one else around? There's nothing going on. The plot is entirely stopped. Why? Because this is the plot. The author is trying to tell you, hey, this is the most important part of the story. The demon fighting and the battles that supplements the love plot. It's not the other way around. Many times nowadays in modern movies, with superhero movies being the best example, when you have a love interest, that love interest is going to be used as an excuse to motivate the hero to fight or to go to battle. With Berserk, it's the exact opposite. That subplot, quote-unquote, of the love story between the two characters is actually the core of it. The actual subplot and the elements that supplement it is what comes around it, all of the battles and all of the developments of the Golden Age arc. Which paradoxically is the reason why this very arc is the most gut-wrenching in the entire story. It's because it's about love. You need to be able to tap into the emotions of the viewer to be able to then subvert their expectation and break their heart. And if we are to look at the globality of human emotions, I believe that love is the strongest of human emotions, and most importantly, of human passions. It is what motivates people to do things. It is what motivates most people, for example, to go to work. Why? To provide for the people that they love. It is what motivates men to go to war and kill other people and be killed, because they want to defend the people back home that they love. If you want to push someone, if you want to make sure that someone gets something done, then you must make sure that this person does that very thing out of love. But this is also what makes love such a good trigger for tragedy, because since it has the ability to move people, it can move them both ways. It can move them towards positive emotions, and it can also move them towards negative emotions. Because if love is the most precious thing that one has, then losing that love is the worst thing that can possibly happen to you. And that is the ultimate tragedy of life, which is why most Greek and modern tragedies rely on that element. They rely on showing you a love, a burgeoning love, and then they destroy it, they crush it, and they crush you at the same time. As French dramatist Jean Anouilh used to say, there is love, of course, and then there's life, its natural-born enemy. Love is a fabrication. It's this fictional thing that we create for ourselves as mere petty humans because it makes life bearable. It is the goal of life. But life doesn't give a fuck about love. Life is cruel, and life times and times again ruin that love. It is the perpetual cycle of tragedy. And if I were to borrow from Joseph Campbell, who discusses the cycle of heroism, where the parcours, the journey of the hero, is always the same throughout every single piece of media, every single book, we see that the same seems to go for tragedy. Every single tragedy, like Romeo and Juliet, like Antigone or Berserk, always does the same thing. They focus their plot around love because nothing is truer to life than characters who are in love and then lose it. Characters who just never get their happy endings. And sadly, in Berserk, it's also the same thing. You are hoping that the characters that you are witnessing and that you end up loving will get to experience that happy life, and times again, the reality of existence, the cruelty of the universe reminds you that life is not that easy, that life doesn't care. Because if life and love share one thing in common, it's that they're both finite. At some point or the other, they're both destined to end. And to be reminded of that fact is the very purpose of tragedy. It's what the Greeks called catharsis. Catharsis is the witnessing of events so terrible that one is, in a sense, forced to face the reality of their reoccurrence in their own life. The events that occur in a tragedy might be hyperbolic or exaggerated, but they are true to life. You understand that at some point or the other, you will have to face a similar level of catastrophe. And the stories that manage to pull off this catharsis with the most effectiveness tend to be the ones that stick with people. It's why Berserk is still talked about so many years later. Most of us got strong catharsis from Berserk, and so we can never quite forget it. It's going to be with us for the rest of our life. And in Berserk, just like in most tragedies, the constant that allows this catharsis to open is suffering. because this is what you see the characters go through the most. People in Berserk suffer a lot. They suffer much more than they love. Not because Miura was some of sadist who enjoyed drawing characters getting torn apart, like I've seen some people say, but simply because the universe he creates, as I explained previously, is an hyperbolic representation of our own. And so, because our world is also based on suffering, and because your experience, your day-to-day life relationship with existence is one of suffering, it is perfectly normal that a word that would be just an exaggeration of that would be full of it. Because the world of Berserk is essentially ruled by what is known as barbarianism. So it's a universe where the rules, the societal norms that are supposed to restrict the occurrence of violence and limit the amount of suffering that humans have to go through don't really exist. It's an open battle, and in a battle, there is very little space for tender emotions and for love. But paradoxically, this is also the reason why these emotional moments where the characters appear vulnerable and get to feel their emotions hit so hard, and why they stick to you, because they produce that catharsis. If I were to ask you, for example, hey, give me 5 moments where Guts feels rage and kills people, you'll have a tough time to pick. It happens so often that it sort of becomes a blur. But if I ask you, hey, give me 5 moments where Guts feels pain and he feels sad or depressed, I'm certain you would be able to tell me exactly what moment in the story it occurs and what plot element triggers that sadness, because you are paying attention to that emotion since it's the one that connects to you the most. It's the one that you have the highest ability to relate to emotionally. And this is why, if I were to ask a Berserk fan what they remember from the Golden Age arc, what is the most marking event, they would tell you the eclipse, because it's the apex, it's the peak of emotions. It's when the tension is at its highest, and we'll talk about that later, but the eclipse is also about love. Or they would tell you about the love story between Guts and Casca, which is peculiar again because it's supposed to be a dark fantasy about battles, and oftentimes Berserk fans are depicted as just gore idiots who are addicted to gore. And nothing could be further from the truth. If anything, people who love Berserk love it because they tend to be people who are extremely sensitive and in tune with their emotions. And because you're so in tune with your emotions, you also perceive that this love story that is given to you in this dark universe is not going to last. As you read it, you understand that while it is beautiful in the moment, it is very likely it's going to be taken away from you and taken away from the character. As the development of the story occurs, you are constantly looking around the corner because you know that in the intrigue there will be a sick twist at some point that breaks the heart of both you and Guts and Casca, and you would be correct in thinking that because this is the development of tragedy. It is part of the grand scheme, because something as beautiful and fragile as love cannot possibly survive in a universe as dark and twisted as the one of Berserk. What's interesting is observing why. It's observing and analyzing this development, because it teaches us a lot about love and about its inherent tragical nature. And to do that, we're going to have to look at the emotional backgrounds of both of our lovebirds, namely Guts and Casca. And we're going to begin with Guts. So I'm not going to try and give you a complete backstory because I already did that. It's a video in the description called You're Not Guts that talks about trauma and how to deal with it. So if you're interested, you can look at that afterwards. But for the sake of this discussion about love, I have to establish that Guts never received any love from his parents because he never knew his parents. And so that's already a deficit. The person that was supposed to provide that for him was his father figure, Gambino. But as we know, Gambino was a total piece of shit who abused Guts and then eventually even sells him to another man for prostitution. And that leaves naturally a double scar. Not only is there a feeling of abandonment because the one person that was supposed to care for him betrayed him in the worst way possible, but it also develops a fear of intimacy because Guts gets sexually assaulted, with the direct consequence being that Guts absolutely refuses to open up to others, And also, he refuses to let people touch him. Because by doing that, by allowing people to get close, both emotionally or physically, he becomes vulnerable. And the one time he was vulnerable, he got hurt for it. So he developed a defense mechanism to protect himself. And this is something that is quite common, sadly, in people who have suffered. Because they have suffered, they build walls around them, thinking that that way they can keep the pain away. And that is absolutely correct. But by doing that, you also keep love away and joy. Because with the possibility of pain also comes the possibility of fulfillment. It is a gamble, sadly. And when you lose at the game too many times, you end up convincing yourself that the game is rigged and that playing it is not even worth it. That is the fate, that is the destiny of the character named Guts. But eventually, he gets recruited by force into the band of the Ark. And I insist on by force because if he was given the choice, he would have said no, again, because of these wars. He does not want to be around people. But the fact that he is forced to interact with these people that are close to his age and that share a similar life story opens his eyes to the fact that this is what he always really wanted. He just wanted to have people around him he could trust. He really wanted a family. And at the same time where he meets this family, he also meets Casca. Casca, which from what we know, is one of the first women he's ever really interacted with, which we see a lot because he is constantly unable to understand where she's coming from because she's purely feminine and he is purely masculine. They're both archetype in that fashion. And that leads to them butting heads. If you remember at the start of Berserk, before they develop their relationship, they are like cats and dogs. They hate each other, or at least that's what it looks like from the outside. In reality, the reason why they constantly clash is because they represent opposites. They are opposite energies that attract each other, and they are both terrified by it, so they try to reject each other as violently as possible. And Casca does it because she constantly likes to point out the flaws in Guts' behavior, and in a way, she is working as a therapist for him because in the story, she always tells him about the things that prevent him from actually healing from his trauma. So, for example, his rash behavior. He has a tendency to be super aggressive right off the bat. Why? To push people away. He's also super cold. That way, he never actually lets other people see his emotions. He's distant. He always makes sure he's away from the group so as not to have to interact with anyone. And he's also super afraid of being vulnerable. So he never lets anyone see his scars. He never lets anyone see him fear or being sad or touch him. All of this participate in a masculine caricature of sorts, because these traits are often described as what you need to be a tough man, but in the case of Guts, it is the thing that prevents him from actually coming into his own and discovering love. And this is something that he is slowly awakened to because he spends time with Casca and he eventually grows to fall for her. But most importantly, he grows to feel responsible for her. And that is the start of love, because love is first and foremost a matter of responsibility. Love is not freedom. It is the exact opposite. Love is a restriction you impose on yourself. Because once you are in love, you now have a responsibility to the people that you love. You have a responsibility to protect them, to stay true to them, and to not become the type of person that is going to eventually come to hurt them. And this is a struggle that Berserk deals with later on in the story. I'm not going to tell you about it because it would be spoiled, but it participates in this constant battle against the darkness within that would push away the people that you love. And Casca is very similar, meaning that for her, her inability to love was also rooted in her past and in trauma. But in her case, it's slightly different. For her, what she feared first and foremost is to be a dependent. Because her backstory is that she was sold into slavery at a very young age by her dad because he just couldn't feed all of his kids. And so whenever like a noble came to buy his daughter, he was very happy to get rid of her. And that is a primary betrayal, just like with Guts. It is the betrayal of the father figure, which makes it very difficult later on to trust other father figures, other men, because you've already been hurt once. But it doesn't stop there. Immediately after being sold, she gets sexually assaulted, or at least her new master attempts to rape her, and she's only saved by Griffith. That is a double whammy. Just like with Guts, it's a double betrayal. Now, it is certain that this person, Casca, is going to be deathly afraid of men, because every single time she was given to a man, she was becoming the responsibility of a man. The man, instead of protecting her, immediately hurt her. And so, upon being saved by Griffith, she decides to never depend on a man again. Which is paradoxical because at the same time she depends on Griffith. Because he is the one to tell her, hey, if you want to be safe going forward and be free, you have to learn how to fight. And you can do that by joining me, by joining my side. So this, in a sense, becomes her new personality. She becomes a subservient to Griffith because it serves her purpose. Now she is no longer a helpless little girl, she is becoming a fierce warrior. And this is another parallel with Guts, where they both end up living to fight instead of fighting to live. In both cases, it's a defense mechanism. They're hiding their true selves. That's not really who they are. Someone like Zod would be much closer to a true warrior who only lives for battle. But both Guts and Casca are not that. At their core, they're children who are never allowed to grow because they suffered young and they never received love. And so they hide their true desires under the mask of the warrior. And Casca's true desire, at least from what she tells us, is to be with Griffith. She wants to be Griffith's woman, but that is made impossible by the fact that they have a difference in rank. He is destined to become a king, and so she can never be a queen to him. That is not possible because she was not born noble. So instead of this desire that she would want to see come into fruition, she is content just being a subservient. She is content just being a lieutenant to him, just being a soldier that works towards accomplishing his dream. Which, as I said, is the exact opposite of freedom, because she essentially just latched onto a new master because she's afraid of being her own master. Every single time in her life she had an inkling of freedom, she immediately runs into the risk of being hurt, of being raped. We see that throughout the Golden Age arc. Casca almost gets raped, I think, 4 times, and whenever it happens, it's because she's by herself. So unconsciously, she has developed this need, this dependence on men. She can no longer exist without being under the tutelage of a man, but at the same time, this is what she hates the most. The only man that she is willing to accept as a god and master is Griffith, because he has demonstrated that he would never hurt her. We know that at the end, she pays for that, for this naivety, because eventually Griffith ends up being the person that hurts her the most. And this is a topic I won't be developing today, but there is a clear focus in Berserk on showcasing the female experience, on showcasing what it means to be a woman in a world where barbarianism is the norm, which also leads me to believe that Berserk is actually one of the finest examples of a feminist manga and a feminist piece of fiction. And I know that this might sound surprising because of the amount of times you see women suffer in the story of Berserk, but that is the point. That is the reason I say that. Miura doesn't showcase that to tell you, hey, look at women getting raped, how great. Instead, it tells you, hey, look at what happens in a world that fails to protect women. Look at what happens in a world where men run rampant with nothing to prevent them from acting, following their impulses. Look at the hell it creates for women. I'm not going to get into that, as I said. It's going to be a completely new segment, but it's an idea I want to put in your head because many people do not seem to understand that, and it's a vital aspect of Berserk. What is relevant to us today is that it explains why when she meets Guts for the first time, Casca is irritated by him. She immediately rejects him because he displays what she fears, so this masculine strength and power, but also what she lacks. In a sense, she's jealous of him because he has a level of freedom that she never experienced. The freedom to be by himself, the freedom to protect himself, but also the freedom to disobey. Something that she times and times again tells Guts is that she cannot stand the fact that he disobeys Griffith because she's personally incapable of doing that. And this enmity is made even worse by the fact that when Guts gets injured, she ends up being the one who has to warm him up. So she has to sleep with him in his bed naked because Griffith essentially tells her, hey, you're the only woman in the camp, so you have to do it. That, of course, is incredibly sexist. Why couldn't you just send Pippin to do it? What is the difference between a female and male body? If anything, Pippin would have been much better, he's much bigger, he produces much heat. But in the world of Berserk, women are the ones who are supposed to comfort men, and so the one woman in the camp, Casca, was the one who was forced to do it. And you would think that with her history of sexual assault, she would tell Griffith to go fuck himself. That would be the proper reaction, but because she respects him too much, she just obeys his every order, and instead, she becomes resentful of Guts, who did nothing. And we'll see that this poisons their relationship at the start, because Casca is also very jealous of the bond that Guts and Griffith seem to have developed, a bond that she cannot have with him because she was born a woman. But that is only at the start, because soon enough, she realizes that Guts is just as much a slave of freedom as she is, and that his relationship with Griffith is doomed. It is doomed to fail just like hers is doomed to fail, for different reasons. Her, because of what I explained, she will never be his queen, and Guts, because his goal to become Griffith's friend is made impossible by the fact that to become his friend, he needs to become his equal, and that also is not possible, because Griffith's goal is to become a god. And we'll get back to that because, in truth, the romance in Berserk is a triangle. It's a triangle between Guts, Casca, and Griffith. But for now, I want to discuss the twist that eventually forced these two to come together, because that twist also teaches us a lot about how love comes to grow and it comes to develop itself in the heart of humans. And that twist occurs when Casca falls off a cliff and Guts jumps in to save her, which forces them to spend a lot of time together, but not just together. They're forced to be naked with each other once again, but this time they're both fully conscious of the situation. And there is something symbolical about this. Clothes are a protection. It's something that we wear in social situations to hide our bodies. We do it for, I'll say, modesty's sake, but it's not the only reason. It's also because there is something very private and intimate about the body. There is something intimate about allowing someone else to see you naked, because now you are without protection, quite literally, and you are at this moment at your most vulnerable. You can no longer hide your true self. And you can also no longer rely on the defense mechanisms you used to employ to make sure that no one could come close to you. So, during that night, when they are in that cave somewhere, both Guts and Casca are forced to do the one thing that they hate the most. Guts is forced to let someone else touch him because he has to cuddle Casca because she has a fever, and Casca is forced to be dependent on a man on top of that she tells herself she does not like. And as weird as it sounds, this is the start of their romance, and this is the start of many romances around the world. When you are put in a situation where you can no longer rely on your strengths, you have to showcase your weaknesses. And in your weaknesses is your true self. That is where your true essence and your true nature lies. And to be able to fall in love with someone and to truly share something organic and tangible, you have to let that happen. You have to lay down the mask, because the only way for true love to blossom is when both parties are maskless, which is something that Salman Rushdie used to say himself, where he discusses the fact that we oftentimes are attracted by other people's strengths, the things that they showcase about themselves, but what keeps us in love and what makes us fall truly in love is when we finally get to see their weaknesses. Because in weakness, there is no lie and there is no deceiving. And because humans are naturally afraid of death, we are going to have a tendency to make sure we never get put in such a situation, which is also the reason why it is so difficult to fall in love. Because to fall in love, you have to have the ability to let go. You have to have the ability to lower your guard. And oftentimes, you will never do that on purpose because it's an instinct that goes directly against self-preservation. So oftentimes it is fate that makes people fall in love. It is fate that puts people in a situation where, for a reason or another, they can no longer rely on their mask and they are forced to be themselves in that moment. And to be clear, this doesn't always result in something positive. It can very well be that you're going to lower your guard, you're going to get close to someone else, and that person is going to use that opportunity to stab you. But this is the risk that you have to take. This is the inherent risk that comes with love. Because if you never open your flank for the knife to penetrate, you also never get close to the person to actually open your heart to them. Which is why falling in love fundamentally is an irrational act. It is not something you can do with your brain, because if you stop for a second and think about it, you'll realize that the risk is way too high. And this is why people who are sensible about love are incapable of it. Because if we all looked objectively at the risk and reward of love, we would all steer clear of it. Because there is nothing in this universe that falls more often than love. Love and acts of love have a very, very low rate of success. And yet, the entirety of humanity depends on that low rate of success for survival. Because if it weren't for love, life itself wouldn't exist. Love is the condition that allows life to perpetuate itself. And this is why, just like life, love is finite. You know that it is bound to end at some point. And because the two parties in love are going to fall out of love, which happens very often, or because one or the other is going to die. But that is a possibility that you have to be willing to accept, because if you tell yourself that you will only love if it lasts forever, then you're never going to be able to love, because your approach to love is one that is based on suspicion and it's based on calculation. You're already looking at the worst possible outcomes and thinking, oh, well, if there is even a slight chance that this goes wrong, then I won't do it at all. But the risk inherent to love is what makes love possible. This is why every love story is a tragedy. When you fall in love with someone, you give that person an opportunity to ruin your life entirely. Which is something that our current generation of men seems to be keenly aware of, to the point that they have now developed a form of phobia for love. How many times have I met men younger than me or even my age who tell me that they will never get married, then they will never allow themselves to fall in love because the risk of it ruining their life is too high. The risk of ending up with someone who is going to sabotage their existence and manipulate their emotions to hurt them is too high. Which is something that seems to be backed up by all of these statistics about divorce, right? Most marriages end in divorce. That is the proof right there that love most oftentimes ends in failure. But this should never be used as an excuse to not let yourself fall in love. That voice that is telling you that is in reality just a fear. It's the fear of vulnerability. You are afraid of giving your heart to someone because you know instinctively that if you give it to the wrong person, this person is going to use it to hurt you and to make your life hell. So essentially, what you're distrusting is not love itself. It's your ability to distinguish between true love and false love. You are, in a sense, developing a form of paranoia where you have started to believe that you are a terrible judge of character and so you cannot be trusted to fall in love. But it is that very fear that is going to prevent you from eventually finding the right person, because when you meet that right person, likely you're going to push them away like anyone else because you're going to be afraid of what they could do to you. Well, if you are in this situation, I'm here to tell you this. Yes, the risk and the pain that come with falling out of love or being betrayed is high. It is tremendously high. One of the worst emotional pains you'll ever experience. But guess what? The reason why it is so high is because the payoff that will occur if you found the right person is much, much higher than that pain. The joy of having someone that loves you for who you are, the joy of having someone that is there for you whatever happens is immense. It is the goal of life 100%. Which explains why, even with all of this information that tells you that falling in love is a terrible idea, even with the knowledge that love is inherently a tragedy, humans will always fall in love and they will always seek out love. Because what you get in return when you take that risk is much more important than the risk itself. And I know what I'm talking about. I'm a man in love. You're looking at a man who is deeply in love. I'm married. I trust my wife 120%. I trust my wife more than I trust myself. She has the keys to everything that I own. She has the keys to my heart, to my brain. If she decided, she could ruin my life in 25 seconds. That is a risk I am willing to take because this is the way I think about this. If one day this love of my life decided to betray me and she took all of my money, all of my possessions, and she broke me down, I would lose something much more relevant and important than all of these material possessions. I would lose my love. And that would be the true tragedy. That would be what breaks my heart. All of the shit that comes around with it, that can be replaced. True love can never be replaced. But to be able to access true love, you cannot be calculating. And you also cannot cling. Love is not the action of clinging. I know that this is something that might be popularized by modern media nowadays, but love is actually the opposite. Love is the action of letting go. You have to let go of your doubts. You have to let go of your paranoia and all of your insecurities. That is the only way to truly love. And we already discussed that with the mask that you have to be willing to remove to show your true self so that you can actually have someone in front of you that will love you for who you are. But it doesn't stop there. You'll also have to let go of the one thing that modern humans put the most pride in, the thing that most people seem to be unable to do away with, and that is their reasons. Because love ultimately is the suicide of reason. You have to kill that voice that tells you it's a horrible choice so that you can experience how great it feels. Or as Nietzsche used to say, there is always some madness in love, but there is always some reason in madness. The reason why men throughout history have chosen times and times again to sacrifice their reason for the sake of love is because this is a deeply human act. This is what defines us. Humans are, yes, rational beings, but they're also emotional beings. And at some point, to be able to feel love, you have to allow the emotions to take over. And this is why, in the story of Berserk, there is only really one character that we never see do that, and that is Griffith. Because Griffith's defining trait, in the Golden Age arc at least, is that he doesn't love. Not because he's incapable of doing it, but because he always makes sure that his reason takes over his emotions, and because of that, he is unable to let go. That is his defining trait. Griffith is a clingy character. He cannot not be in control. He cannot not wear a mask, because all of that are defense mechanisms that he built around himself in order to accomplish his big dream. And this also proves true for every single war general. When you're responsible for a troop of men, you cannot succumb to sentimentalism. You cannot start caring about your men individually, because if you did, you would no longer be able to send them to their deaths. So you are forced to regard everything through a pragmatic lens, which is something that is very important to say right now, because I want to make clear that I don't think that Griffith is unfeeling. I don't think that he's a sociopath or a psychopath. I think that he turned himself into a form of cold robot because without that, he would no longer be able to move forward. If he started to regard Guts or Casca, for example, as valuable friends and comrades, he would no longer be able to send Guts on suicide missions that are necessary to win battles. So it is because of this reason that in his mind and in his view, humans, the ones that surround him, his quote-unquote friends, have turned into assets that only exist to achieve his goal. And he even states at some point that the only person he could really regard as an equal and so as a friend would be someone that he could no longer perceive as an asset, someone who would literally exist above his dream, meaning someone that he cannot just appraise for their usefulness because they're doing their own thing. They don't just exist to serve his dream or his cause, they are their own person. So it doesn't mean that he cannot love, it's just that he's installed requirements for himself to be able to love others that are so twisted and out of reach that he has made it effectively impossible for him to feel anything for anyone that lives or exists around him. Again, It's a defense mechanism. These are walls. These are walls that Griffith put around himself, not necessarily to protect his sense of ego or his emotions, but in this case, because these are the walls that will be needed if he one day wants to get his kingdom, if he one day wants to get his castle. And I think that this is made especially evident by that scene where we see him carry the corpse of a dead soldier in his arms, a very young boy. And he states that he has seen that boy play with toys, and he wonders what that boy's life could have been if he hadn't died on the battlefield. This is him reflecting on the price of his dream and on the price of the love that his soldiers have for him. They love him so much, they adore him so much that they're willing to sacrifice their very life just so that he can achieve that one dream, that one petty dream that is more like a tantrum, something that is impossible to achieve. But it is because it is impossible to achieve that the amount of corpses he's going to have to pile up to get to that dream is so high. And so he cannot care for his soldiers, not because he doesn't want to, but because if he did, every single soul, every single life he sacrificed for that dream would be for nothing. He would no longer be able to move forward. And we'll see that this is this very self-inflicted sociopathy that will be his eventual downfall. Because humans cannot just bottle down their emotions like this. It's not possible. At some point or the other, something is going to break. And when that dam breaks, the tsunami that comes rushing out of it is sure to damage and to just wipe out everything in its path. So I think that the lesson that Miura is trying to teach us with the character of Griffith is very clear. Miura is telling us that one that renounces love for the sake of something greater, even a dream, will come to find out that that dream, one, pales in the face of what love could bring, but also that there is absolutely no way of achieving that dream. Your need for love and your emotions and your passions are going to take over eventually, and are going to result in the death of that dream, but also the death of everyone you refuse to love. That is a trope that you find in every single ancient tragedy. A hero with a grand goal that eventually runs into love or a lack of love that just throws a wrench in the entire enterprise, which results in him and everyone that surrounds him dying a pitiful death. But that's only in the hyperbolic sense, because in your day-to-day life, you're very unlikely to experience tragedy to that level. The tragedy of love that most humans will experience when they shut down their emotion and are unwilling to let go, they cling onto things, is that they will live a life of quiet desperation. They will live a life where they will be so afraid of the potential damage that love might bring or might cause that they will forbid themselves from ever feeling that. And interestingly enough, we also have an example of that in the story of Berserk, because Judo is that very archetype. Judo was a very important part of the band of the Ark, but he was only part of the band because he had convinced himself that he could not do anything greater than that, which also led him to believe that he was not good enough for Casca, the woman that he loved. So he spent his entire life quietly suffering because he was never able to express that love. In my opinion, because he was afraid. He knew he was going to get rejected. He knew he couldn't compete with Griffith, so he kept it bottled down. But that did not make him happy. It made him absolutely miserable. And so that is the second lesson that Miura is teaching us. It is better to suffer at the hands of love than to never feel love itself or to never allow love to express itself, because a fear of love is in reality a fear of life. It is a form of life denial. When you don't allow yourself to feel love or to get hurt by love, you are essentially already dead. You are a walking corpse. And this is where tragedy comes into play. Nietzsche believed that tragedy had the power to transcend the nihilism inherent to the human existence, as the action of loving and losing that love effectively gives meaning to the world. And we see that with Guts and Casca. Casca being the most relevant in this scenario, because she used to fill her existence with meaningless battle and meaningless obedience, and she was never able to realize that this wasn't truly fulfilling and this wasn't a true meaning until she started to develop feelings for Guts. But once she started to find that love within her for that other person, she found that meaning that transcends all else. And in a perfect world, both Guts and Casca would have realized that. They would have left the band, they would have started a family, and they would have lived happily ever after. But unfortunately, the story of Berserk is a tragedy, so we know it's not going to be that easy. So what happens instead is that Casca fails to awaken to these feelings. She gets in her own way in a sense, which is also something that happens times and times again in tragedies, where you'll have characters that are so obtuse to their own feelings that they end up creating their own demise. We see that with Romeo and Juliet. The fact that at the end they could have just both survived and lived happily together, but because they're so deep into that traumatic turmoil, they end up both killing themselves when there was actually no reason for that. It is the essence of the absurd that makes the tragedy. And we see that same level of confusion and quiproquo in Berserk, because Casca fails to realize that what she feels for Griffith and what is preventing her from following Guts is not love, it's adoration, and the two are not the same. Love is supposed to be an exchange, it's supposed to be equal, it's supposed to be balanced, it's supposed to make you grow. Adoration, on the other hand, is purely transactional and it's one-sided. The person that is being adored is the one that benefits. The person that adores gets nothing. If anything, they lose because they're the ones that are constantly giving. And it's only when the two men finally fight that she realizes it, because when she sees Guts fight Griffith, she can feel in her heart that she wants Guts to lose. Not because she wants to see Griffith prevail as the chief of the band, but because she knows that if Griffith manages to beat Guts, Guts will be forced to stay. He will be forced to stay with her. And that is the tragedy of this situation, just like with Romeo and Juliet. If she had been able in this moment to realize this, she would have been freed from Griffith's influence. She would have just been able to follow Guts and the story would stop there. And the same goes for Guts. I'm not just blaming Casca, he's just as much of an obtuse idiot. Because in his eyes, he thought truly that Casca was in love with Griffith. He didn't realize that the true love that she felt was for him. And so when he left the band, he left with regret because he loves Casca, but he also thinks that it's for the best because that way he will allow her to stay and to be with the man that she loves. Times and times again, Casca told Guts, hey, it would have been better if you were never here, that way I could have Griffith for myself. In saying that, she was lying to herself, but Guts sadly doesn't have the emotional intelligence to know that, and so he leaves. And I think that that can be impaired entirely to Guts' low sense of self-worth. He thinks so little of himself that he doesn't believe himself to be worthy of love, and so he's incapable of accepting the possibility that someone could love him for who he is and who would want to follow him. And sadly, it is that quiproquo that precipitates the rest of the events of the story. Now, just for a precision, I know that the English use quiproquo in a completely different fashion. Here, I'm using it in the tragical sense, meaning a situation where characters misinterpret the situation and the scenario, and they confuse an action for another, which leads them to take decisions that are rash, that eventually leads to their demise. That is what quiproquo means in that context. Just to clarify for those of you who might be confused by my use. And in the case of Berserk, that quiproquo is brought forth by what I just described. Because if Guts and Casca had left, whatever happened to Griffith afterwards would have been outside of their circle of understanding, and so they would have never come back for the eclipse, which also means that the eclipse would have never occurred, because what triggers the eclipse is the presence of Guts, and it is the presence of Casca, which also points towards love being the trigger of this entire tragedy. Times and times again, Guts is on the verge of death, and Griffith could have just shrugged his shoulders and said, well, he's just one soldier, I don't care about him. But every single time, Griffith goes out of his way to save that one man that eventually becomes the catalyst for the catastrophe of the eclipse. If we go back through the fight against Guts, what happens to Griffith after that fight is that, one, he loses someone that he cares for, and accepting that is already a lot. But also, he has to face the fact that he failed. He failed for the first time in his life. And that is completely in opposition with the mask he was trying to build for himself, because that mask was supposed to make him more than human, and nothing is more human than failure. Failure brings you back to your humanity. If there is one thing that we all have in common, is that we have failed in our life. And to an average person, that is just an opportunity for growth. That's actually what God tells himself. He tells himself, hey, you just tripped on a pebble, but that's nothing. You'll get back up. You'll get your dream. But to Griffith, it doesn't work like that. To Griffith, in his own psyche, he is a god. He's not allowed to fail, and he's not allowed to feel like a failure. And so to be able to cope with this situation, the fact that he was brought back to his humanity that he was trying to push away, he tries to reassure himself by doing something that would, in a sense, manage to bring him back to his status as a superior. And that very something is the reason why he ends up in prison in the first place. He sneaks into Charlotte's chambers and he has sex with her. This is a very rash and impatient action, something that goes entirely against his tendency to calculate things and to be reasonable. For once, Griffith throws reason to the dogs. And because of that, he pays a hefty price. Because he was attempting to precipitate his ascension to the throne by physically getting the princess, he gets caught by his father, the king, and all of that goes to shit. His entire dream literally ends up at the bottom of a dungeon. Another interpretation would be that Griffith needed to be reassured, he needed to be comforted after losing two gods, and so he used sex as a means of receiving affection, which once again shows that we are dealing here with a human. That is a very human reaction. But interestingly, it is this human reaction, this lack of rationality, that leads to the king finding out, because Griffith is not thorough enough, he doesn't hide his tracks enough, and so he eventually leaves enough proof of what he did. And you'll notice also that the king gets very upset at Griffith, not just because he took his daughter's first time, that would already be good enough reason, I guess, but because the king himself is in love with his daughter, which I don't think is just something that Miura introduced in the story randomly. I don't think it's a part of the plot that was just there for shock value, because eventually the king attempts to rape his own daughter. I think that this part of the story is there because it's also a trope you find a lot in tragedies, where unlike what you might think at first glance, the people that are the highest ranking in society, the kings and the queens, are not magically devoid of passions. If anything, they're the ones who are the biggest victims of passion, for the same reason that Griffith was so easily swept away by his own emotions, because their role within society dictates that they are not allowed to feel. They are supposed to exist above the masses. They're supposed to be constantly calculating in their approach. And so whenever that mask falls, the explosion of passion tends to be much greater than the average person, and the consequences are also horrible. I think that we see that with Ivan le Terrible, Ivan the Terrible. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think that this is the historical figure who, in a fit of rage, killed his son, and you have this famous painting where you have like the face of Ivan the Terrible, and he looks haunted by his action because he was so overtaken by passion at this moment that he did something he would never do otherwise. And whether you are a peasant or a king, this is something that we can all relate to. Love makes us all equal in the face of passions. You, in your life, at some point or the other, are going to do something very rash and out of the ordinary for you, because you will be swept away by a wind that you will not be able to control. Which means that, regardless of our status, Miura is telling us that we are all slaves to love. Because where there is love, there is no reason. Which also means that love exists outside of the boundaries of morality. Because an act of love cannot be categorized as either good or evil, since that would presuppose that the act itself was motivated by something other than love, meaning reason, meaning that you would have thought in your head, what I'm about to do is good or it's bad. But as we just established, it's not the case. When love and passion take over, rationality goes to sleep, which also explains why love stories are always tragedies. because the things we are willing to do for love often far outrank what we would be doing out of hate, for example. Because in hate, you still remain a semblance of reason, and so you are very unlikely to break certain boundaries of morality. But if you're motivated by love, all of that goes out of the window, which is why on a battlefield, no one is more brutal than a soldier who is fighting for love. And no stories are more brutal than tragedies, because tragedies are also always motivated by love, which is why Aristotle believed that the hero of a tragedy could never be totally evil or purely good, because this would make any act of love on his part impossible. And this is why both Guts and Griffith, who are the hero of a tragic story, are morally grey characters. You cannot say that Guts is purely good or purely evil, and the same goes for Griffith. As I demonstrated, there is some good in him. This is what gives him the ability and the capacity for evil. Because if you had someone who was born bad, could you really say that this person is evil? They don't really have a choice. It is the fact that humans have that choice that makes it so that when they do something evil, it is so reprehensible. And we see that with the impact that the eclipse had on people. The fact that it shocked so many readers is because it was triggered by someone that we trusted. As a reader, we never thought that Griffith would be able to do that. Why? Because the story very intelligently presented him as someone who was capable of both evil and of good. And so, as a result, he was unpredictable. And it is this unpredictability that makes the core of the tragedy. Because if I give you a story that is bad from A to Z, you're not going to feel much. Because at no point am I allowing you to believe that something good could occur. It is because I'm going to give you just enough joy and just enough love that you're going to be heartbroken when eventually I take it away from you. And this is why, according to Nietzsche again, every matter of love takes place beyond good and evil. This is also why people are so afraid of love. You never truly know if the person that you love is good or evil. And so you never truly know what they're going to do with your heart. But it is this risk, as I established earlier, that makes it interesting. If I could give you a pure angel of love and light to love for the rest of eternity, you wouldn't want it. Because it's not interesting. It lacks the risk. And it's the risk that tantalizes you. And I think that the same can be said for Guts and Casca. I think that they were both attracted to each other's darkness. There are certain things that happen in their romance that is fucked up, right? In their first time together, Guts has a PTSD attack and he essentially sexually assaults Casca, or is in the brink of doing that. That should be the death sentence of the relationship, but it's not. Because in that moment, Casca is able to relate. She understands where he's coming from. She understands that this is his baggage. And she's not going to push him away for that because she also has her baggage. And this is something we can relate to. Nothing takes you out of a story more than when you are shown a romance that is perfect, where there is no fights, there is no resistance, there is no friction. That's not realistic. Love is war. It's a battle. It's the best battle you'll ever fight, but it is a battle indeed. It takes effort and it fucking hurts. Because when you love someone entirely, you also give that person immense power over your feelings. There's only really one person on this earth that can hurt me with words, and that's my wife. Because she knows my every weaknesses, and she also has so much weight in my eyes that whatever she says, I'm going to take seriously. Now, I'm willing to take that risk because I know that she's not going to abuse that power. But you never truly know. And this is why both Guts and Casca are at the start reluctant to open up. They've been hurt so much that they don't want to have it happen to them again. But when they finally do, they realize that the benefits that could come with this vulnerability far outrank the risk. And now you have the story of two individuals who are learning to love, but most importantly, to heal together. And this is why we're so invested, and this is also why, when this is taken away from them and from us, it is so painful. It's because we had a glimpse of the happiness that could have been, and that happiness was destroyed in front of our very eyes, which is, as I said at the start of the video, the sign that Berserk is a good tragedy, because a tragedy only works if it manages to make you believe that the characters whose downfall you witness in the story are real, that they could be real in real life, and that their experience is anchored in something that you could go through. Because nothing is going to capture your attention more than something horrible happening to someone that is like you. Because you instinctively know and understand that if these events could lead to their downfall, it could also lead to your downfall. So while catharsis has this emotional dimension to it, we cannot disregard the fact that a tragedy is also, in a sense, a life lesson. And yes, of course, the life lesson is always over the top. You look at l'Iliade et l'Odyssée, and you look at the mind-blowing amount of destruction seemingly caused by one woman, Hélène de Troie, and you tell yourself, how is it possible that so many seemingly inconsequential and disconnected events could lead to so many deaths? And the same goes for Berserk. How did such a beautiful and poetic love story eventually lead to something as atrocious as the eclipse? Well, if we look at the chain of events and we observe each of them individually, we see that actually it is much more realistic than one would think. So, if we are to recap, out of jealousy, which is a perverted form of love, Griffith threw his life away. Then his men, out of adoration for him, which is also a perverted form of love, decided that they wanted to go at his rescue. Guts, out of love for Casca, decided to help them, which is the sole reason why, by the way, why Griffith was liberated. If Guts hadn't been there, they would have lacked the manpower to get it done, which is the ultimate middle finger from fate, because it is the good sentiments and the good hearts of both Guts and Casca that led to their lives going to shit, which once again shows that matters of love exist beyond good and evil. Just because they had good intentions doesn't mean that things went well for them, which, as I said, is the reason why people are afraid to fall in love in the first place, but also why the betrayal of Griffith is so disgusting, because he betrayed the people that loved him the most. But once again, and contrary to popular belief, this does not make him a monster. It just makes him human. We see how his psyche devolved after his torture. He was no longer able to move his body, he was no longer able to lead the band, and worse than that, he was starting to realize that Gut was most likely going to become his replacement, and that he was going to get Casca. He was going to lose everything at once. Because keep in mind one thing, to become an apostle, you have to sacrifice people that you love. If Griffith had been unfilling, he would not even have been considered as a potential candidate for the position. If he had just been a purely calculated leader who just views his soldiers as pawns, then the god hands would have ignored him. It is because he was a human capable of love that the egg of the emperor got to him. Because the god of causality knew that eventually he would be put in a position to make that choice, to decide whether or not he wanted to sacrifice the people that he loves. And so, while shocking, his decision also shouldn't come off as a shock. If you pay attention to his character arc, it actually makes a lot of sense. Griffith's plans worked as long as he was able to keep a cool heart. The second he gave in to his passion, everything went to shit, and his passions were triggered by his love. As such, when given the chance to sacrifice the very object of that love, the thing that he blames for his downfall, he of course didn't hesitate. And while we hate him for it, because we grew to care for the troops, we have to keep in mind that he also did. This is what makes him evil. He had the choice. And this is where the difference between good and evil resides. In that very choice. By deciding to sacrifice his loved ones for his dream, Griffith became evil. And by deciding to sacrifice himself for his friends, Guts became good. But originally, the energy that pushed them both to make that choice was love. Therefore, it isn't love that is good or evil, but the choices that we make because of it. Interestingly also, by becoming an apostle, Griffith barred himself from ever making that choice again. Because once you sacrifice the people that you love, you become an unfeeling monster. So from now on, any act of love becomes impossible for him. And in a way, I think that's what he wanted. It's very easy to just shut down your empathy for Griffith once he becomes femto because you hate his fucking guts. But you have to understand that the choice that he made was purely reasonable. This is why it was evil. Once again, he refused to let go. He clinged onto that dream because Griffith understood that to get his kingdom, he couldn't be human. He had to become something more. He had to become a god. But because he by himself was not able to be that and to kill his emotions, he instead did the only thing he could. He let that choice in the hands of someone else, that someone else being the god of causality. And yes, that is a very cowardly choice. But this is the true meaning of the words, I want wings. I don't know if you read that chapter. There is an erased chapter of Berserk where Griffith comes face to face with the god of causality. And when asked what he desires, he tells him, I want wings. And what he means by this is that he desires the ability to fly above the masses in order to never get attached again. He wants to separate himself from his humanity so as to never have to deal with emotions and love again, because it is these emotions and that love that prevent him from reaching his dream. And this is also why the first thing he does upon becoming a god is to rape Casca, because it's a way for him to renounce his humanity forever. It's also a way for him to get back at Guts, because he blames Guts for the emotions that he felt, the emotions that led to his downfall. And there's of course clear Christian symbolism in this. Griffith, who was always referred to as the Ark of Light, who is always compared to an angel, who is the one who carries the light, literally, which is the meaning of Lucifer, who then goes through this fall from grace and who gets reincarnated as a demon. That is the exact story of Satan, who was the most beautiful angel of paradise, but who refused to bend the knee in front of God and in front of humans, and who was cast down from heaven for his arrogance. And it is this very arrogance that then leads Satan, and that is clearer in the Islamic tradition, to tempt humans. Because his new goal is to prove to God that the so-called perfect creation that he put on earth, the humans, are not so perfect and that actually they're exactly like him. So times and times again, he attempts to tempt us to sin so as to prove that we are just as bad as him. And Griffith, Femto in this case, does the same thing to Guts. By raping Casca, he is mocking him for his humanity, he's mocking him for his limitations, but in a sense, he's also inviting him to become like him. He's trying to trigger enough rage in him that Guts himself turns into a demon and into a monster. And as we established, the real horror of the scenario and the situation, beyond the action of raping, of course, is also the fact that he's doing that to the two people that loved him the most. Because if you look at the pre-eclipse, Casca was willing to sacrifice herself to spend the rest of her life taking care of Griffith. She was willing to go that far. Guts was willing to come back from his quest for self-improvement to save Griffith, even though he had nothing to gain in this. These two are examples of love pushed to the extreme. Love that is punished. Punished because they put that love in the hands and in the arms of someone who was not worthy of trust. But unlike what Griffith might think, it doesn't make him superior. If anything, it's the exact opposite. It makes him a highly contemptible creature, because not only does he commit a blasphemy against love itself, he also sacrifices his very ability to love. Not because he's a Übermensch or because he transcended the limitations of humanity, but because he's a coward. Griffith was afraid of ever getting hurt again, he was afraid of ever losing control, and so he decided to take this rash decision of just completely renouncing that ability entirely, instead of facing the true challenge of humanity, which is to deal with the consequences, both joyous and painful, of that love. And in that sense, he has the exact opposite character arc to Guts and Casca, who both started like this, but who learned to love. And you'll see, and again, no spoilers, that their story going forward after this event is one where they will have to relearn how to love. They never renounce that love. Sometimes they get on the verge, and we see that with Guts, because Guts is tempted to renounce his humanity to be able to find and kill Griffith, but times and times again, he is reminded by the people around him that this would actually be a mistake. A mistake, by the way, that every single apostle in the story commits, because they all have the same character arc. It's always individuals who went through something traumatic in their life, who suffered at the hands of love, and who then decide to give up on humanity entirely and become monsters because they're afraid of ever suffering again. Every single apostle deep down is a coward. And the story seems to corroborate that, because times and times again, the fate of these apostles proves that they made the wrong choice. By refusing to suffer in the moment and becoming immortal, they also gave up on the very possibility of a good life. Which is why when an apostle is killed, they return to their original form, which is always wretched and sad. Because it's the exact representation of the life that they led. It's the exact consequence of their choice. They have decided to deny love, and so they have also denied life itself. And I find it important to highlight that point in particular, because many people who start to get versed in Nietzschean philosophy end up believing that to be a Übermensch is to do exactly that. It's to become a monster, it's to reject emotions. But nothing could be further from the truth. If anything, to be a Übermensch is to be more human than human. It's to become superhuman, not because you are above, but because you sublime what it means to actually experience humanity to its fullest. You sublime what it means to accept suffering, which also means that you have to reject immortality, because immortality is the opposite of that. It's the rejection of suffering. It's the rejection of death. But if you reject death, you can no longer be human. And if you are no longer human, you cannot be superhuman. I think that this is one of the most important lessons that Berserk teaches us. Via its story, Miura teaches us that the ultimate goal of life is to embrace it in its totality, pain and joy alike. And in that regard, there is no truer path than love. According to Nietzsche, tragedy is the equivalent of staring nihilism in the face, except instead of turning away from life, it allows one to look at existential dread through an artistic medium. And I believe that Berserk accomplishes exactly that. By writing a love story that ends in tragedy, Miura didn't intend to discourage us from loving. Rather, he wanted to show us that even in the face of absolute misfortune, love is always worth it. And that is going to conclude this now very long video. If you made it this far, congratulations. I hope that it was enjoyable. And if you enjoyed this segment and this essay, please consider supporting the channel on my Ko-fi page. It's the first link in the description. You can donate or you can pledge a membership. $3 a month already makes a massive difference. Because at this point, this channel is my second job. And so the more support I receive on the Ko-fi page, the more time and energy I can spend making these long videos for you guys. I have many more ideas for philosophical essays in relation to Berserk. The next one that might be coming next month, if I have the time, will be one about existentialism in the story of Miura. I'm super looking forward to it, and I hope you are as well. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.